The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, so I want to be both careful in reporting this story to you, but I also don't want to hold back what are some very strange elements of what we've learned so far. And this is a story about left-wing attorney Michael Avenatti. He has come to, I guess we would call it fame or prominence over the last year or so. He represented Donald Trump's hush money mistress, Stormy Daniels, who was, of course, involved in one of the sort of prominent scandals involving Trump, this $130,000 in hush money paid to her. Michael Cohen was involved in that. Supposed big dudes intimidating her were involved in that. Avenatti was representing Stormy Daniels there. He has also broken news of sexual assault accusers of Brett Kavanaugh, who is the now newest Supreme Court justice. He also broke video of Tucker Carlson in a shouting match with a Hispanic member of Tucker's country club. And the news as of last night is that Michael Avenatti has been arrested in Los Angeles for suspected domestic violence, domestic abuse. And I want to go through this sort of sequentially in terms of what we knew when, because that has a lot to do with what's weird about this story. So we'll start at the very beginning. News breaks reported by a number of media outlets that Michael Avenatti has been arrested by LAPD in Los Angeles for domestic violence against his estranged wife, Lisa Story Avenatti. So at this point, knowing nothing else, in the same way that when women accused Brett Kavanaugh, when women accused Bill Cosby or whoever, we should trust the victims unless and until there's information that comes out that makes us doubt the truth of the story. Is it possible that a lawyer who has done so much pro bono work to expose domestic abusers and sexual assaulters of women might himself commit domestic assault? Of course it's possible, and there's no reason at its face to doubt the allegations. So far, no problems whatsoever. Los Angeles Police Department tweets confirming the arrest, so we know that that part is true. They said, quote, update, we can confirm that Michael Avenatti, birth date February 16th, 1971, was booked this afternoon on a felony domestic violence charge. His bail is set at $50,000. So as far as Avenatti himself, I've been saying for months that while he's done some good things, I have some disagreements with him. I have never been a huge fan of his presence in the Democratic Party milieu. I never thought that the guy ought to run for president in 2020, which is something that's been talked about. But I can't deny that he's been an effective operator in many ways. So at this point, I'm thinking I have no particular reason to doubt the allegations. I'm not a huge fan of his, but I recognize good things he's done, not so good things that he's done, fine. But then very quickly, the domestic assault story starts to get weird because his estranged wife's lawyer puts out a statement saying, despite media reports, Michael Avenatti wasn't arrested for anything he did to me. This is his estranged wife speaking. I haven't seen him for months. And in fact, when we were together, he never was violent, period. He never did anything that even approached physical violence. Okay, that's kind of odd because it's being reported that he was arrested for something he did to this woman. And this woman says, this has nothing to do with me. Meanwhile, Michael Avenatti's first wife tweets something pretty similar, saying, I've known Michael Avenatti for over 26 years. We met when he was 21. We were married for 13 years. Michael has always been a kind, loving father to our two daughters and husband to me. He has never been abusive to me or anyone else. He is a good man. Okay, so still, it wasn't his most recent wife that is accusing him of violence. His first and second wives both say he's never been violent, but could he have been violent and have hit another woman? Of course he could have. And as always, when it's on the left or right, doesn't matter to me. I say we should trust accusers and take their accusations seriously and investigate. But is there actually an accuser here? Starts to become the question. Then TMZ, which originally reported that it was Avenatti's ex-wife, said, you know what, we were misinformed. It's another woman who has alleged domestic assault on Michael Avenatti. Our source says, this is TMZ talking, our source says there was a shouting match outside of a luxury apartment in Los Angeles. Security eventually brought the woman into the building, and Avenatti eventually went in yelling, "She hit me first." Now, is any of that actually true? I have absolutely no idea right now. And then something even stranger happens, if you can believe it. Remember the fake sexual assault allegations that were concocted about Robert Mueller by this young Trump supporter named Jacob Wall and this totally fake company called Surefire Intelligence? These offers were made to two different women, at least two different women, of $20,000 each if they were willing to make fake allegations that Robert Mueller sexually harassed them or assaulted them. It completely blew up in their faces. The Surefire Intelligence Twitter account tweeted last night a link to the Avenatti arrest with the message, "Surefire Intelligence strikes again," apparently meaning to imply that they may have been involved in getting Michael Avenatti arrested. If they did do this, why would they admit it? I have no idea. None of Jacob Wall's actions have ever made sense to me. But could someone, knowing that California has this mandatory arrest policy for domestic violence calls, could this all be a right-wing plot to get Avenatti back for his activism? It's definitely possible. The next step is we need a specific and actual accuser where we say, this is the person making the allegations. Because right now, all we know, Pat, is that the accuser that was initially named in the report denies that they had anything to do with it and that Michael Avenatti did anything to them. So for me, Pat, it's, yeah, trust victims, but who's the victim here? Is there actually a victim?
Yeah, and that's why, at least now, we want to reserve judgment. But notice how we're saying that we want to investigate and get to the bottom of this, find out who the actual victim is. Contrast that to the right-wingers when one of them gets in trouble for domestic abuse or sexual assault, sexual misconduct. They don't want to have the investigation. A guy like Brett Kavanaugh, even though he was accused of attempted rape, just push him onto the Supreme Court. We don't have to look into his background.
That's exactly right. And so right now we know that an initial incorrect report about Avenatti's ex-wife being the victim was retracted. And as of right now, again, by the time you listen to this, by the time you watch this, maybe we'll have more information. There is no actual victim that we know about. And we have a really sketchy organization with a history of trying to fabricate sexual assault allegations against public figures seen as adversarial to the right. I don't say people on the left because Robert Mueller is a lifelong Republican. People seen as adversarial to the right, and they posted a strange message sort of seeming to take credit for something related to the story. The story as we know it right now is that, and I'm sure that Republicans are going to say, until we have definitive evidence that Michael Avenatti did this, we have to assume he's innocent, right? Because that's what they said with Brett Kavanaugh, although I'm having a little trouble finding those comments online from right-wingers when I look for them. Donald Trump has had an absolutely disastrous week. He's losing cabinet members at record rates. He's reportedly shrunk into not doing a damn thing, just watching TV at the White House. He had only 1 hour of scheduled time a couple of days ago, and otherwise he had this executive time. We had the France disaster over the weekend. So what does Trump do? He calls a press event at the White House, fills the stage behind him with black people to talk about criminal justice reform, to continue trying to foment this idea that he is just the best for black Americans. But, and this might actually surprise some of you, the reform that Trump is supporting actually does contain some good things, except there's no chance that this is actually going to get passed, and the timing of it is obvious political grandstanding. So I'll tell you about the bill. There's some bipartisan support for this bill. It's going to be almost impossible to get the so-called tough on crime conservatives to support what is called the First Step Act. Some of the things that the bill would do, loosen mandatory minimum sentencing laws. This is something that Trump's former Attorney General Jeff Sessions was very much against, but Jeff Sessions was fired last week, so who cares what Jeff Sessions thinks anymore, right? Lower mandatory minimum sentences for drug felonies, reducing the 3-strike penalty from life in prison to 25 years, reducing the disparity in sentencing between crack and powdered cocaine. This is a very racialized disparity. Crack is more of a poor drug, more prevalent in non-white areas, whereas powder cocaine is the sort of middle class version of it, more prevalent in white areas. So that's a racial disparity that exists. This would reduce mandatory minimums when a firearm is used during a violent crime or a drug crime. This gives judges discretion to go below mandatory minimums in certain cases. It includes some provisions to lower recidivism. It would place federal prisoners closer to home. It would allow for more home confinement for lower level offenders. Now, coincidentally, Donald Trump had absolutely nothing to do with drafting this legislation, but that's okay. It's actually probably for the better. So the perspective on this is that the bill does do some good things at the micro level. It does nothing to deal with the macro level of our prison system and our justice system and incarceration issues. But the real problem for me, Pat, is that this just, I don't see how this passes the House this year. And thus Donald Trump saying, hey, you know what, middle of November, this is what I'm going to do an announcement with black people standing behind me for. That's the pandering.
Well, maybe during the next congressional session, it would have a chance at passing. At the risk of being called wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, naive Pat, maybe there is some hope here that Trump will reach across the aisle. He did express some interest in working with Nancy Pelosi, congratulated her on taking the House. We had this suspicion when he initially became president because he's not ideologically tied down to the ideas of the Republican Party. So we thought maybe he would reach across the aisle then. But then he went on to try to repeal Obamacare and pass Republican tax cuts for the rich. So that didn't end up happening. But hey, maybe there's a chance now.
Well, listen, even if this were to pass, and I've made no, I've not hesitated to say that if Donald Trump does something, even coincidentally, even out of completely the wrong motivations, if he does something that I agree with, then I'll say, hey, here's something I agree with. Does this change that this was maybe one of the worst, most embarrassing weeks for Donald Trump of his presidency? No, it does nothing to change that. Does this change that most likely nothing is actually going to be passed under the current Congress, and thus choosing to make the announcement with a big press conference with black people behind him is a total optics play? It definitely doesn't change that. But if it passed, there are some things in it that wouldn't be bad. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I know you probably have never heard me mention this before because I mention it so infrequently, but this is a program that is supported by the audience through membership and through Patreon. And two people I want to thank today are our new member of the day, David Ornheimer, and our long-term sustaining member of the day, Anthony Dixon, who's been with us for 5 years since November of 2013. David, Anthony, thank you. Really appreciate it. You can join them at www.joinpakman.com. We have a coupon code. This is 2020. This is 2020. All spelled out except for the number, which is just 2020. Does that make sense, or is that more confusing? Use that code to save 40%. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month. It sounds like it wouldn't do anything, but when thousands of people do it, those single dollars start to add up at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Okay, I think it's fair to say that 2020 fever has sort of hit a lot of the David Pakman Show audience, because this morning I was on the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit, where we have moderators and respectful political conversation happening with more than 7,000 of our viewers and listeners. And I spotted an interesting thread about 2020. We've been talking about what about Bernie for 2020, and user R Fishbine 91 says if you like Bernie Sanders, also consider Senator Sherrod Brown for 2020, saying that she already talked about why she thinks Sherrod Brown would be a phenomenal 2020 candidate for the Democrats, that the good news is that Sherrod Brown is actually considering it. And this user outlines Sherrod Brown's progressive voting record, points out that he might have more appeal in the Midwest than Bernie Sanders. I actually think that this is very interesting, and it's not interesting for any reasons of sort of ageism. I know that people have sometimes said that when I talk about running an old white guy against an old white guy, that there's something of a sort of identity argument being made. And that's really not what it is. But I actually do find Sherrod Brown interesting as a candidate, Pat. Now, I'm not as closely aligned with him politically. I took my political alignment test last week. I'm mostly aligned most closely with Bernie and with Elizabeth Warren. But Sherrod Brown is an interesting name to throw in here.
Yeah, I want to reserve my judgments until all the candidates have announced. But I take it that if Bernie Sanders runs for president again, I'm going to support him. Now, the real question is if Bernie decides not to run, who are we going to back? Is it going to be Elizabeth Warren? Is it going to be Sherrod Brown? That's a totally open question.
Or even Joe Manchin. Maybe the progressive base will align behind the most conservative Democratic senator in the country. I think not. And that would be a disaster. I'm obviously kidding. That would be the exact wrong direction for Democrats to go. Also from the David Pakman Show subreddit this morning, a discussion about what the Democratic platform should be. And this is relevant in two ways. What should the Democratic platform be for 2020? But also it relates to a question we're going to answer on the Friday show about what should be the Democratic priorities when they take over the House. And user Free Range Grape says that he would like to see single-payer health care, or at least limiting insurance company overhead to 5% or so, enacted. Switching to the metric system like the rest of the world. I just don't know that you're going to win too many votes with that one. I agree 110% that we should switch to the metric system. I think that there are significant financial costs to switching in the short term. I just don't think the metric system is a voting issue, Pat.
Probably not. I don't think we're going to win back any voters who were disenfranchised by Hillary Clinton. The states like, Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, they're not going to vote based on the metric system.
No, I don't think so either. High-speed rail transportation, I think that that's great, although in a lot of parts of the country, it's sort of a non-starter with our elected officials. Renewable and clean energy, absolutely. Publicly funded elections, absolutely. Free community college and affordable public universities, allow student loans to be forgiven under bankruptcy filing. All very, very important. And answering the question, how will we pay for all those things? Answer, according to Free Range Grape, the same way we pay for the massive military budget. Yeah, I think that this is actually, putting aside these specific issues, it would be really great for Democrats and the left in general to have a more structured response to how are we going to afford that? Because there's a few different ways that you can start answering that. One is saying, well, it's money we're already spending that we can just reallocate. Sometimes the answer is slightly higher taxes on the rich. The truth may be a combination of these things, but I do think the left has to get better at answering that question, because it actually is an obvious question that the middle and the right is going to ask, and we need to be united on what the answer is. Lastly, from the David Pakman Show subreddit this morning, Jordan Peterson seems to have lied about serving a United Nations Committee on Climate Change. Yeah, you know what? A bunch of people emailed me about this story, Pat, and said, you've got to cover this. And I looked into it. It does indeed seem that Jordan Peterson at one point claimed to have actually served on a UN committee about climate change. It seems the truth is that he once in some way advised someone who served on such a committee. I don't even care. Like at this point, I feel like for the majority of what we do on the show, Jordan Peterson is an interesting component of this movement known as the intellectual dark web. But the specifics of when Peterson lied or told the truth, I feel like are not particularly relevant to our sort of narrative and discourse.
Is that because in this postmodern world, what's true and what's not true isn't discernible anymore, and it's all just subjective now?
Yeah, what is truth anyway, right? Like, what does it even really mean to say Jordan Peterson lied? Do we even know what a lie is? Do words have any meaning at this point? The answer is no, if you're participating in the toxic postmodernism of the left. Yes, if you are trying to argue with so-called SJWs or whatever. Anyway, join the discussion, davidpakman.com/REDDIT. A lot of really good conversations happening there with more than 7,000 of our viewers and listeners. I have a very disturbing story for you today about guns and race and good guys with guns that we have to talk about. And there is this very racialized pro-gun argument that is sometimes made around people of color and guns. Sometimes you hear this from the pro-gun right when they want to pretend as though the NRA is not an extraordinarily racially tinged organization. And what they say is, this is their argument, not mine, we want everybody to have access to legal guns, including people of color. And the reason it's important for people of color to have legal access to guns is that they are more likely to live in dangerous neighborhoods, and sometimes they have more of a need to defend themselves against other people who are violent. That's sort of the argument that you hear them make. And yet, we rarely hear about the NRA coming to the public defense of black people who had firearms or used firearms for self-defense or merely had guns on them when they had an interaction with the police. We've even had some specific cases we've covered in the last year and a half that I've told you about, where you had legal gun ownership by black Americans that got them into trouble when they were stopped by police. And in many of those, the NRA literally said nothing. That's the sort of pretext, the context. Cut to this weekend in Illinois. 26-year-old black man Jemel Roberson was working security at a bar called Manny's Blue Room in the Chicago suburb of Robbins, Illinois. There was a shooting at the bar, and Jemel Roberson was there working security, like I said. Roberson was able to apprehend the shooter, and when police showed up, they shot and killed the black security guard Jemel Roberson, who had again apprehended the actual shooter the police were called and were responding to. The officer who killed Roberson is white, and you be the judge of whether that's a factor as we talk about the story. The way that it went down is that Roberson had asked some drunk people at the bar to leave, a common occurrence at bars. One of those drunk people came back with a gun and started shooting. Roberson was able to get the shooter down on the ground with his knee on the shooter's back to prevent him from getting up. And according to what I've read, had taken the shooter's gun and was holding it on the shooter's back along with his knee, waiting for police to arrive. Now, there is one report that says Roberson had his own gun as well as a valid firearms ID card. The other reports say that it was the shooter's gun that Roberson had appropriated for himself. But either way, when police showed up, he had the suspect down on the ground, knee on his back, gun on his back. Police show up and shoot the security guard dead as people were reportedly yelling, "He's security, he's security." The police who are now investigating say that when police showed up, they yelled at the security guard, drop the gun, and eventually shot him dead. They also say that part of the confusion was that Roberson wasn't wearing any clothing that identified him or indicated that he was working security, although there is a conflicting report which says he had a hat that said security. At the same time, a lot of people just wear hats that say security or shirts that say security. That's become popular. So where that plays into this is not totally clear right now. A lawsuit has been filed claiming that Roberson's civil rights were violated. This now is going to extend for a long time with this legal case. And also notable here and tragic is that the actual shooter in the initial bar shooting, as of this morning, hadn't yet been charged. So my question is, where's the NRA on this? Roberson had a valid federal firearms identification card. He did not have a concealed carry license. We heard from the Midlothian, Illinois police chief. What we have learned is Jemel Roberson was a brave man who was doing his best to end an active shooter situation at this bar. So what are we to make of this, Pat? Because the defenders of the police are saying, listen, police were called to an active shooter situation. They show up, and a man is kneeling on another man's back with a gun pointed at him. Any reasonable police officer would say, oh, we were called to a shooting. We see a guy with a gun. That's the shooter. Let's do something about it. But is it actually that simple? If the officer had been black or the security guard white, would it have played out the exact same way? And I don't deny for a second, Pat, and you come from a law enforcement family, Pat, there's no question that a quick judgment has to be made by police in these situations. And the issue here is whether that quick judgment was in any way influenced by race. And I don't know whether we will ever actually have that answer.
Well, certainly the NRA doesn't want to cross paths with law enforcement because they do make up its base of supporters. But I mean, there are many examples. This is just the latest one. 2 years ago, Philando Castile, a black man driving in Minnesota, was pulled over by a white police officer. And he did the right thing, Philando Castile did. He said that I have a gun on me. I just want to make sure that you know. And then he reached for, I don't know if it was his phone or his license and registration. He reached for something, and the cop said, don't reach for it, and shot him dead. So his civil rights were also violated. No due process there. He followed the formula for what you're supposed to do if you're pulled over and you have a gun on you, and yet he was shot dead. And the NRA stayed silent on that one, too.
I want to hear from you about this. What do you make of it? We are going to be posting some comments that we receive on this story on the David Pakman Show Instagram page, at David Pakman Show. While you're there, you can follow me at david.pakman. We will take a quick break and be back after this with our investigation into what is the solution to the social media free speech deplatforming problem that many say we have. That's next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Let's talk about social media today and this debate we've talked about that's been taking place about whether big social media companies like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook should be regulated by the government to prevent what some are calling censorship. We're probably all familiar with this phenomenon of social media companies temporarily or sometimes permanently banning creators on their platforms for violating terms of service. And especially after the recent ordeal with Alex Jones and the backlash that followed, there has been a lot more focus on this issue. And in fact, there was sort of a national discussion, which is still taking place, about, number one, should First Amendment free speech privileges extend to major social media platforms owned by private companies? If so, at what point are the companies big enough, the platforms big enough where that should be the case? How much power should these platforms have to deplatform individuals like Alex Jones? Does the government have a responsibility to step in and prevent what some are considering dangerous censorship? And the Alex Jones incident specifically prompted the Justice Department to actually look into this and to start an investigation into supposed censorship and political bias by these social media companies. Social media executives have been questioned at Senate hearings about this, and there's a certain contingent of the public that is sort of in favor of government intervention to enforce free speech on major social media platforms, whatever that means, and we'll talk about that. Even President Trump weighed in where he said, quote, social media is totally discriminating against Republican conservative voices. Speaking loudly and clearly for the Trump administration, we won't let that happen. They are closing down the opinions of many people on the right, while at the same time doing nothing to others. Censorship is a very dangerous thing and absolutely impossible to police. If you are weeding out fake news, there is nothing so fake as CNN and MSNBC, and yet I do not ask that their sick behavior be removed. Social media platforms should be audited and regulated when it comes to preventing foreign influence in American political elections and affairs, particularly because much of it would just simply entail better enforcement of already existing laws that are designed to protect the democratic processes in the United States. So there's actually no reason for any controversy there, although it's not clear that the Trump administration is actually really concerned about that, at least not that we've seen. But as I've said in previous segments, I am not in favor of having the government force privately owned social media companies to publish the content of people that they don't want to be associated with, even if it's supposedly in the name of free speech. It's a knee-jerk reaction to a problem that I don't even really think exists. No one can honestly say that these platforms, like YouTube, for example, aren't accommodating right-wing voices. That's one of the most ridiculous aspects of all of this, which is how fabricated all of this social media free speech outrage is. Both left and right-wing channels have been affected by YouTube demonetization, including our channel. Some have tried to argue that YouTube is overrun or completely dominated by right-wing channels. I don't agree with all of those claims because progressives do have a strong presence. But the right is also not having trouble on YouTube. And you might even be able to say that YouTube is the home of the millennial conservative movement. Almost all of the right-wing or anti-PC personalities who are popular among millennials owe their fame in great part to YouTube. Steven Crowder, more than 2.5 million subscribers. Jordan Peterson, 1.5 million subscribers. The Daily Wire has about 1 million. Rebel Media, Rubin Report, Milo Yiannopoulos has a strong presence. Stefan Molyneux, Lauren Southern, Blair White, Gavin McInnes, even alt-right white nationalists like Jared Taylor and others do really well on YouTube. And you might say, well, hold on a second. Some of those people have been banned or they've been suspended on Twitter, and I think that was unfair. But the thing is that plenty of people further to the left or in the middle or with no political affiliation get banned all the time, and often for no good reason. And Twitter has also received a ton of criticism for not being vigilant enough about neo-Nazis and other right-wing extremists on the platform, as has YouTube. So I think a lot of these deplatforming processes are just inefficient or admittedly too opaque, but there is simply not enough evidence that the most popular social media platforms are making it difficult for conservatives to broadcast their message just on the basis of their being conservative. So now that we've identified what the problem is and is not, what is the solution? Number one, the inconsistency and non-transparency with regard to the deplatforming by social media companies is the real problem. It's not the fact that they're able to choose whose content not to publish. I have no problem with that because that is their right. Who they block, how they do it, and why, that's up to them. Instead of trying to solve this false dichotomy of who should control speech, Silicon Valley or the government, we should be asking ourselves, how can we preserve private companies' First Amendment rights, but shift the decision-making power back to the hands of the people? And the answer is for social media companies to establish platform policies that are more clearly defined and more even-handedly enforced. Vague and briefly described rules about hate speech or defamation or offensive content or whatever leave the creator not knowing where the line is, and it leaves the public not knowing whether the company was being impartial when making a decision to deplatform somebody like Alex Jones. And maybe some sort of public statement about why someone was banned and a description of the process should be offered if the deplatformed person had more than a certain amount of engagement or followers on the platform. We don't get anything close to that most of the time with the majority of these platforms, and it would renew some of that lost trust, or at least create some transparency where the public is able to judge for themselves, is the platform banning people in a way that is consistent with its own guidelines, and how are they applying those guidelines in practice? Why would social media companies do this, you might be asking? That's a good question. How do we actually make it happen? We have to demand it of them, right? Undoubtedly, these companies will have to become more transparent and accountable about algorithms and flagging and suspending accounts if it is something that will affect their image and their brand in a way that has an impact, right? Failing to do so, if it makes them less competitive against other social media platforms, will force them inevitably to come along and offer a solution to the problem that we've identified here. The first battle for the social media market was about functionality and addictiveness, and services like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, they won that battle, right? But many have said that as we become more pessimistic about social media companies, what they do with our data, how they handle things like deplatforming, that finding solutions to those types of issues will actually become the next battle for gaining and retaining users, and that there will ultimately be some winners and losers. We think of something like Facebook as this sort of eternal monolith, but they've been having some pretty serious PR issues over the last couple of years, especially the last 6 months, and that comes with real financial consequences for the company. I don't think individual social media platforms are as immortal as some make them out to be. Remember what happened to MySpace. Look at the downfall of Tumblr, for example, although it's still around. Twitter and Facebook themselves have been having issues in terms of user numbers, especially lately, and it's been affecting their stock prices as well. Social media is in its infancy, and we can be certain that Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube are not the indefinite be-all, end-all of online communities. More are going to come and go, and here's the ultimate irony with all of this about regulating social media censorship. And I've talked about this before, and you knew I was going to talk about it today. It's usually the right that's determined to preserve the free expression of private corporations. And when it comes to anything else like environmental protection, consumer protection, workers' rights, stabilizing the economy, it's the right who always says the free market is going to work everything out. There's a natural incentive there. It doesn't matter how big or powerful the companies become. There will be free market pressures that will force them to ultimately do the right thing. We don't need to worry about it. We don't need to regulate it. Are right-wingers now arguing that, oh, certain energy companies have become so dominant that we have to ensure that they adhere to their responsibility to the public to mitigate environmental harm? The way they are saying Facebook has a responsibility to the public is nothing they are willing to say when it comes to energy companies, financial companies, or any others. It's only when the right perceives that their group, their side, their tribe is getting the short end of the stick, do they all of a sudden want to impinge on that free market, and they choose to be outraged. It's sort of like when right-wing commenters or right-wingers on the internet talk about how there's this big conspiracy in Hollywood to promote a progressive agenda. To be totally realistic, the corporations that control Hollywood don't care about anything but making money. And Hollywood makes money by taking the temperature of the country and giving consumers what they want, whether it's TV or movies or music or video games. These occupy people's attention as much as social media, and it's about making money ultimately. Are we also going to regulate the messages of those industries the way right-wingers are saying we should regulate social media? I'm not hearing that. What about the advertising industry, like Nike and Colin Kaepernick? It's only about making calculated financial decisions to improve the company's bottom line. It's not about political propaganda for its own sake. And it's the same thing with social media companies. Facebook and YouTube didn't ban Alex Jones to push a progressive political agenda. They banned Alex Jones because their brands were suffering when they were seen as mouthpieces for an unhinged conspiracy theorist. One who they also considered, by the way, to have violated their terms of service, which is granted something they could have done a better job about spelling out, like I said. But Facebook and Twitter are not responsible for the free speech of others. You were responsible for finding a platform on which to speak. You are responsible for finding content you want to consume. And the internet makes it really easy. There are even a lot of new apps and websites that let you consolidate all your social media feeds into one. And those types of services are making this free speech controversy even more moot. And we really shouldn't forget in the end that mainstream corporate media companies like Fox News, who are really pushing this whole social media free speech regulation agenda, are doing so out of their own interests as well, which is something that's often not considered in the debate. It's sort of like when the Wall Street Journal and CNN write articles about YouTube and advertisers, because any new regulation or roadblocks for new media are a win for them. And government regulation of free speech may not be as neutral as many think that it would be. You would have enforcement that could change with administrations and congressional majorities. One proposal has been to form a commission similar to the FCC, where officers are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. And conservatives should be just as afraid of that idea as progressives, because the entire thing would be a big mess, subject to the whims of whoever's in the White House and controls the Senate. The entire internet itself as a whole is a shared resource and a public square, which, yes, should be kept free and open and equitably available to the public with the help of government, but not the privately owned platforms that operate within it. There isn't enough justification to encroach on the rights of those businesses to make their own decisions on behalf of their shareholders. There are definitely problems right now with how some of these social media platforms handle reprimands and consequences. But the government coming in and imposing harsh control of tech companies to enforce this sort of amorphous, unspecified version of political neutrality would be very sloppy, it would be hasty, and it would be an absolutist response. And importantly, it would be one that is ironic when coming from mostly small government conservatives, as they describe themselves. The current situation, as imperfect as it may be, is actually more tenable than what many are proposing in terms of broad, aggressive, anti-censorship enforcement. And I think that a free market alternative should be our first line of defense. And after all, isn't that what conservatives have been calling for all along in every other industry?
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Hey, this is sort of weird. This has gone now beyond the potential even of parody, because it's as bad as any parody of a president could ever possibly be. Donald Trump gave an interview to the Daily Caller during which he defended voter ID requirements by arguing that if you go buy cereal at the grocery store, you have to have a photo ID. We are without a doubt in an idiocracy at this point, and it's exceeding accurate description by the English language at this point. Donald Trump, again, during this interview, was asked about the recounts going on for the midterm election, Florida, supposed voter fraud. Trump recently saying that he thinks people voted, went home, put on disguises, and went back to vote again. And here is a quote from this Daily Caller article about what Donald Trump said. "The Republicans don't win, and that's because of potentially illegal votes," Trump complained. "When people get in line that have absolutely no right to vote and they go around in circles, sometimes they go to their car, put on a different hat, put on a different shirt, come in and vote again. Nobody takes anything. It's really a disgrace what's going on. If you buy a box of cereal, you have a voter ID," Trump continued. "They try to shame everybody by calling them racist or calling them something, anything they can think of when you say you want voter ID. But voter ID is a very important thing." So we're going to talk about the actual comment in a second here. What's even more stunning is that the Daily Caller published this section of the interview without any comment about the absurdity of what Donald Trump is claiming, without any indication that during the interview they even thought to push back against what Trump is saying with something even as simple as, "Mr. President, what do you mean when you buy cereal you need a voter ID? What exactly did you mean by that? Obviously, you do not need an ID to buy things at the supermarket. If we want to sort of play the can we possibly be as charitable as possible game, which at this point, I don't know why we play that with Trump, but let's play it. If you pay with a check, it's possible that the supermarket might have a policy of saying all check payments need to be accompanied with a photo ID. Maybe. I searched around, and this is actually not the first time that Donald Trump suggested this. Check out this video clip from, I think this was late July, early August at a rally.
You know, if you go out and you want to buy groceries, you need a picture on a card. You need ID. You go out and you want to buy anything, you need ID and you need your picture.
What's even funnier is that after Donald Trump said this, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders had to defend it. And she pretended that obviously Trump was talking about if you buy alcohol, you need an ID to prove that you're 21. And notice what one of the reporters says to her when she tries to make this case.
When was the last
Major.
time the president went to a grocery store?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure why that matters either. Major, go ahead.
Last night that you needed ID to buy groceries.
Grocery store. You go to the grocery store, I go to the grocery store. I've never had to show an ID
been
to
a
buy
lot
my
lately, actually.
grocery store. I've never had to show an ID when I go to buy groceries. Most
Certainly,
people don't.
if you go to a grocery store and you buy beer and wine, you're certainly going to show your ID. I don't think that.
Who doesn't drink meth?
He's not saying every time he went in. He said when you go to the grocery store. I'm pretty sure that everybody in here who's been to a grocery store that's purchased beer or wine has probably had to show their ID. If they didn't, then that's probably a problem.
This is just the best. Sarah Huckabee Sanders says, well, listen, if you buy beer or wine, you do have to show your ID. To which the reporter says, Trump claims he's never had a drink in his life. That doesn't make any sense. And she says, well, no, I don't mean him specifically. Just if someone, Pat, went and bought alcohol, they would have to show ID. Isn't this just a new low of idiocy?
Well, I actually have a different theory. So in the Daily Caller quote, he said that if you buy a box of cereal, you have a voter ID. Not that you need a voter ID, that you have a voter ID. So that suggests to me that the voter ID comes free with the cereal. It's like the surprise inside. You know, whenever you buy Cheerios,
instead of,
Fruit Loops, a voter ID comes along with it. And I guess it has your picture and everything you need.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense if you're looking to be identified as Tony the Tiger when you go vote, which I don't know if that's actually something that Trump would be in favor of or not. This has just gotten too stupid. And part of this, obviously, is that Trump just doesn't shop for groceries. He never has. That's not an excuse, though. If you're the president, just because you haven't ever shopped for groceries doesn't mean that you're excused when you say things as stupid as, hey, listen, voting for IDs for voting makes sense because we already have IDs for buying cereal at the grocery store. Unbelievable, the depths to which we've sunk. Hey, here's some good news. We are now I'm saying we're at 95% on the new studio, Pat. Are you sort of in line with my assessment there?
Well, you said that recently, and we were nowhere near close to 95%. We were perhaps 30%, so I don't trust your judgment on this, unfortunately.
Okay, good. Well, so anyway, let's edit out what Pat's opinion is on this, and I'll just come back to me. I am now, because we are doing so great with the new studio, I am ready to go back to some of the fun things that we were thinking of doing on the show. And one of them I want to go back to is this idea of a David Pakman Show bingo card, which was in a few different subreddit threads at davidpakman.com/Reddit. There was a sort of group of proposed elements for a David Pakman Show bingo card where people could play along. And these are all things that I say frequently on the show. Pat is now part of the possible bingo card, things that happen on the show. So I want to refocus on actually getting this bingo card thing done. So let me remind you, I actually printed out, you could hear the paper, which makes it real, just like on the Rush Limbaugh show where he makes paper noises. So you know that it's really all backed by paper. Here are some of the things people suggested. It would be great to consolidate these, maybe in one Reddit thread. Email me if you have other ideas. But here are some funny things that could be on a David Pakman Show bingo card. And a lot of these, Pat, are really good. David asks the caller, are we on speaker or Bluetooth? That happens all the time. Also, another possibility would be caller actually is on speakerphone or Bluetooth. We might actually need both of those, Pat, because both happen very frequently.
Yeah, it's actually a frequent occurrence, though. Maybe too frequent for bingo. That happens once every live call segment, at least.
Yeah, if it's happening every week, it's not really a good thing. Okay, David saying quite frankly, that happens. David punching the mic, that's also one that is probably only every couple of weeks, so that could be a good one. David chuckles or says right over the audio of a news clip that's playing. Yeah, people write in. Some people write to me, Pat, saying they like that you can sometimes hear my reaction in real time to the video clips. Other people say that I'm just interfering with them just hearing the clip. I don't know. It seems the audience is kind of split.
I like it. I think it adds a little bit of something extra to the video clip. People can see that video clip on its own if they want to, but If they want to see our take on it, they got to hear the chuckling, they got to hear the right.
That's been my view, but who am I to tell the audience what it is they should want? Caller is exercising or in a noisy area during the phone call. Yes, that is a problem we've dealt with. David asks caller, what would it take to change your mind? Yeah, I've adopted I've adopted the defeasibility question with callers when they call in with something outrageous and it's clear that they're not really open to having their mind changed. And so I ask them, what evidence, if I had it, would change your mind? And that does sometimes open interesting lines of communication. I think that that's a great one.
Oh, I love it too, especially because when you say that there is no evidence that could change your mind, that means that your beliefs are not rooted in evidence. And that's kind of a conversation ender right there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. David says sabotage, but pronounces it sabotage and references William Shatner. I do say that. David says with peace and love. There's a lot of these David says ones, which I think they need to be, it needs to be a mix of phrases, but also things that happen. So I don't know that we can do all of these, but people want with peace and love on the bingo card when I call something a gong show, when I say that something is abortive, or use the word depraved, or reference fetishists of any kind, like a constitutional fetishist or a Second Amendment fetishist or whatever. David uses the story segue. Hey, this is sort of weird. You know what's funny about that? I did that last story. I introduced the last story about Trump and cereal by saying, hey, this is sort of weird. Sometimes I don't know how to transition from stories that are very different. And hey, this is sort of weird is kind of a natural way to me.
The other thing you do is desperate attempts at alliteration. Like you'll introduce a story by talking about Donald Trump's depressed, deranged, depraved national security advisor, whatever else it is.
Yeah, I remember doing it with that woman from, what was that woman's name? She's so irrelevant. Kim Davis, I think it was, who was refusing gay marriage licenses to people. I would introduce her as something like, completely corrupt Kentucky County Clerk Kim Davis, but it was like way more. I don't even remember what the other ones were.
She lost her re-election bid. She was a victim of the blue wave.
I saw that. David using the term apoplectic. David says, but you might be saying, hold on a second, David. Yeah, that's how I broach when I want to sort of give what a right-wing argument might be and then take it down. I will sometimes broach it by saying, now, you might be saying, hold on a second, David. And then I kind of go forward. I recognize I do that. And here's a Pat one. Pat says, I'm going to push back a little bit on this one, which is a phrase that you do sometimes use, Pat, when you are sort of like announcing to me and to the world that you are going to be disagreeing with my perspective. I think that that is one that should be on there. I'm going to push back a little bit on this one.
Yeah, I like that because whenever my counter arguments fall apart, I can just act as if it wasn't really my position and that I was just trying to play devil's advocate. So that's how I prevent that from happening.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So send me your thoughts on these. Send me thoughts for others. The next layer that we need to figure out after we figure out what's included in the David Pakman Show bingo card is what do you win if you win David Pakman Show bingo? And the other thing is I am looking into having a soundboard for the show. And so like now that I sometimes will say, please vote or please sign up, it would be great if I was able to play what the source of that is, which is like Jeb Bush saying, please clap when he made an applause line at a speech and nobody clapped. So what would be on an ideal David Pakman Show soundboard? Like would the Eggman be on it saying, Shalom, brother? Which is how he signs off from his voicemails. What would be on the soundboard? Anyway, let's work on that, and we're going to get all of that together. Okay, here is a really positive voicemail. I was able to, the voicemail number, by the way, is 2192 David P. A caller notified me that I was able to disabuse him of being sucked into the anti-SJW sort of fascistic rabbit hole on the internet. Take a listen to this. Really good news.
Hi, David. I am somebody who has been on the left virtually my entire teenage years and early adult life. But about a year and a half ago, I started to fall into the anti-SJW community. And from there, I sort of started going to this community that's like ostensibly libertarian, but sort of like flirts with fascism and that sort of stuff. And I started watching videos from people like Ben Shapiro and Stephen Crowder and Dave Rubin. And it was getting very, very bad. But very recently, in the past like 3 or 4 months, I started watching your videos. I started finding your channel. And it has been a big help in sort of de-radicalizing me and putting me back on the left. And I feel much stronger about it than I was before. So, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, and hopefully this gives you hope that some people do change their mind. So keep up the great work, David. Take care.
Absolutely fantastic. This is genuinely good news. We have successfully deprogrammed somebody who got sucked into this online. I don't know even what to call it always, but I think we all kind of know this red-pilled, whatever phrases they like to use on the internet. Very, very good news. We've got a great bonus show for you today. I hope you'll join me. You can get access to the bonus show as a member or as a patron. Thanks to everybody who has signed up over the last several months. Visit davidpakman.com/deals for exclusive deals from our sponsors for David Pakman Show viewers and listeners.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.